really until like the Democratic Party can sort of crawl itself out of the hole, there's not going to be much of a vehicle to shift these things. And that's sort of the number one issue with a lot of things here.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We are on with Matt Lech and David Griscom. Folks, thanks for joining. I appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, same.
So I wanted to start off with David, if you could talk to us some about Texas. Y'all have a lot of stuff happening over there. The first Texas Starbucks workers won an election. You, of course, had the horrible massacre over there. You've been writing a lot about what Abbott has been doing with the COVID stuff. You know, people talk about COVID tyranny, and Abbott has actually been doing some COVID tyranny. So just talk to us about what is going on in Texas right now.
Well, I mean, there's a hell of a lot. I mean, first off, shout out to 45th and Lamar here in Austin for winning their union election. I think it was 10-1, which is pretty exciting. I think there's 10 more stores coming down the pipeline too. I mean, I guess maybe I could start with Abbott and we could, zoom out from there, because all of these things sort of touch on what's been happening in the state for the past 20 years, where once the Democratic Party completely imploded, the state has been controlled de facto by the Republican Party, right? And it's been like 22 years. And in a state like Texas, that really matters, just in the sense that Texas's constitution was set up to have a weak governor. So, we don't have to debate whether or not Texas is a southern state or not. But it does have this big difference from a lot of other southern states, where it does sort of have that kind of Western populism, where like the legislature has tremendous amounts of power and the executive branch is really, really weak. And the governor has always been really weak in Texas historically. So like, unlike a lot of other states, like they don't get to select their own cabinet. All of those kind of executive functions are appointed by the governor on like a staggered basis. So they're like a council, or they're just straight up statewide election. But what's happened is because after the Democratic Party started to completely fall apart here, the Republican Party has been in power for so long that everybody who is in the executive branch is basically a loyalist. And this got really strong under Rick Perry. And then Greg Abbott, who is just like, people don't know him. Like, this is a guy who is, paralyzed because he got hit with a tree when he was a young lawyer, sued the homeowner and the tree company for something like 22 million plus, right? And when he got into power in Texas, he basically capped the amount of non-medical damages that somebody could receive for a personal injury, right? Like and that was because that was former President Bush's big thing when he was in Texas politics, was limiting the amount of money that you could win in a personal injury lawsuit, right? So just like knowing that this is somebody who's just always willing to go with the win. But just to fast forward a little bit, he inherits this extremely centralized governor position from Rick Perry. And then he continues to expand on that using the same kind of tactics that Rick Perry used. And then COVID hits. And Texas was like almost every other state. They locked down. Everyone was sort of following the same playbook until you started to see this backlash from, the right wing, and particularly like small business owners. So Abbott almost immediately starts to rescind a lot of those restrictions. But the notable thing is he never has ended the state of disaster declaration that he put into place at the beginning. And the state of disaster declaration in Texas gives the governor the ability to basically act like a full-on executive without having to worry about anything that the legislative branch does. And it was set up in the 70s so that when there's a flood or something like, or a hurricane here, that you can get resources to people quickly. That's what it was designed for. And Abbott every month, in a very, no frills, like kind of ceremony, extends that disaster declaration. And he's used that, first off, he was using that to basically overrule school districts, the legislature, cities, counties, all other kind of authority in the state. But it's not just limited to him basically blocking any kind of COVID restrictions. He's also declared a disaster at the border using COVID-19 as the pretense. So he is declared a disaster at the border, saying undocumented migrants, are bringing over COVID-19 into Texas, so we need to have a state response to that. And he has created a parallel system to the Border Patrol. It has been a cash bonanza for private contractors, and it hasn't really done any of the things that he set out to do, like drop the politics, of what you want there. Like literally just like on what he sets out to do, he wants to catch, people bringing drugs over, etc. They're not really doing very much. And we're upwards of a few $1 billion. He's also building the wall. And it has been a real human disaster, not only from what people are facing who are trying to cross the border, but also for the National Guardsmen. I'm going to talk about suicides for a second, folks. The suicide rate of National Guardsmen is actually extremely high because people are stuck at the border, and people probably know how that system works. These people have civilian jobs. They lose their jobs. And because they're called up by the state, they don't make as much money as they would if the federal government was calling them up. They also don't get the same kind of health care that they would if they were getting called up by the federal government, or in the instance of them being killed in action, their families don't get, typically the government will immediately give you something near like $100,000 to your family, your immediate family, if somebody passes away. Here, they just get basically workers' comp, which is much more limited. It's paid out, every 2 weeks. And there's a lot of paperwork, and it's very easy to, misfile. And you can imagine a family grieving in a moment like that, making a mistake, and they're not getting access to that. And yeah, a lot of people unfortunately have died. Most recently, must have been late April. A guardsman died drowning because he tried to save a migrant family that was trying to cross the Rio Grande. And, they have done nothing for them. And it's just a scandal top down. In that situation, it was extremely egregious because when they were getting grilled by the legislature, the National Guard's system and leadership there, what was the protocol for people getting into the water? They said, we don't have one. Do they have flotation devices? No. Just remember, their $3 billion has gone basically with no strings attached to these people, and they don't have a protocol about people going into the water. And remember, we're talking about the border in Texas. You're talking about the Rio Grande. You're talking about water. Right. It's extreme. The scandal goes really deep. Last thing just to note before, I'd like to hear y'all's thoughts on it. But last thing to note too is, in addition to just the deployment of these National Guardsmen, they also ran a parallel system of truck checks. So when goods and services, but when trucks come over the border, they get checked by Border Control Customs, right? Abbott set up a parallel system where the National Guardsmen and state troopers were also inspecting trucks, which meant that all of the food, all of the goods that cross the border, we're talking, it's a significant border, a lot of trade goes through it on a daily basis, completely shut down for days. People weren't able to get over the border. Food was rotting in trucks. And again, remember, because he doesn't actually have the legal authority to create a system parallel to customs, all they could do was check the headlights and, make sure nothing's hanging off the bottom of the truck. So it was pure symbolism. And what does he want to do with that? He wants to get invited on Tucker Carlson and impress, Bubba guy in Tennessee about how he's the real serious governor on the border. And I just have to note that, in this moment when he finally got his big Fox News spot, the headline that, the little ticker they put at the bottom was not Greg Abbott strong on the border. It was, is Greg Abbott the Ron DeSantis of Texas? Which is certainly not what he had intended there.
That's awesome. Well, is it Texas? Is that one of the places that the National Guard people are looking at unionizing?
Yes. So there has been, because the Biden administration, the Justice Department, said that they will not, I can't remember the statute, but they will not pursue, because it's illegal for, servicemen to unionize in this country. But there's a carve out for people who are called up on state level missions, and then they can unionize basically with the state employees union. And the Biden administration said that they will no longer prosecute National Guardsmen for doing that. So yeah, there's been a really exciting and promising movement of these National Guardsmen to start to unionize. Because this is just bread and butter stuff. The craziest thing about the mission that they're on is that Biden has also called up the National Guard to the border as well. So oftentimes these guys are serving next to somebody who might be from New Mexico or something like that, right? A National Guardsman from New Mexico who's getting the federal pay, getting the federal health care benefits, getting all those kind of protections. They're doing the same job, and there's just like this, bureaucratic difference in how they're being taken care of.
And are any of the, anti-COVID people barking at Abbott for retaining these emergency powers?
No, because Abbott's smart because give him credit. Like he has a shrewd legal mind. You can see that even in the kind of bills that they've been passing through the legislature, like on abortion, for example, right, where it's not the government necessarily who's pursuing the cases against people, it's private citizens. Like they're finding ways to get around the legal system and the Constitution of Texas, basically. And the way that he does these COVID protocols, most people aren't really paying attention to him. There has been a lot of pushback from the right wing on his border actions because they are just seen by most people as one, failures, and two, just like, it's a huge giveaway. And even some of the crazy right wingers who ran against him for governor have been barking at him about, the waste that he's been creating. But no, that's why I wrote the piece for Sublation Magazine, because a lot of people don't realize where he's getting these powers from. A lot of people, obviously, state governments can be a little archaic and confusing for folks, don't realize that the governor actually traditionally doesn't have this power in the first place, in Texas at least. So, the way that he's doing it is quite sneaky. And, I talk to people all the time here, and they have no idea that that's how he sort of has gotten all this extra executive power for himself over the past past few years.
Are those checks still happening of vehicles coming across the border?
No, they shut it down. So basically it was an immediate disaster, and it cost the nation and the state, somewhere upwards of like $12 billion to just trade shut down. And you know how capitalism works. People start making calls and demanding changes. So what he did was he had these really publicized meetings with governors from Mexico over the border states, where they signed a piece of paper that said, we will do more on the border. Again, like not legally binding. Again, this is like the point, though, and I think it's the point about the way a lot of Republicans are governing across the country right now too. Where like the governor does not have the ability to sign foreign treaties. That is a power that is reserved for the federal government, and Abbott is just doing this kind of stuff. And of course, it's symbolic, and these agreements are toothless, but it gives him the ability to say, like, look, I made these guys, and they drive to Austin, the Mexican governors, right? So it's like sort of embarrassing for them, And it took him a little while to get everybody to sign, but all four of the governors of the border states all sort of signed these, again, toothless agreements with him, and he shut it down. But the damage was done at that point. Like the second that he made that order, the delays were going to take probably 2 weeks to them, rectify themselves.
Yeah, that's just kind of mind blowing when we're already experiencing supply chain issues. You're just going to make it worse, all for a little PR that. It's hard to see how that even helps him in the long run. But I guess that's Texas politics, much like Alabama politics.
Well, I think he failed. By his own standards, I think that he thought that this was going to work out a little bit differently. I don't know really what he expected was going to happen. I think that they thought that maybe they'd catch somebody with fentanyl in a truck or something like that, and they didn't. And then I always remind people, it's like, you would know by now if they had been successful, because there would have been a photo op.
Right.
Looking for the Cheech and Chong, the Cheech and Chong van.
Yeah. Well, Ben, we do still need them. We're going to be playing those clips here in just a second. But yeah, the right wing is never going to miss a media opportunity. If there is a victory to be had, perceived by them, then they're gonna take it. That's why somebody asked me about gas prices yesterday. Like, why do you think gas prices? He said, your side, quote unquote, doesn't seem to think that Biden's responsible or whatever. And I was like, well, yeah, I don't really think he is, because conservatives can never point to any oil production that he stopped, that was going on, and that he stopped. And so, we can talk about, the things that they point to don't even make any sense, like the Keystone Pipeline. It's not, I'm open to say, if he was stopping oil production and raising gas prices, will show me, but they don't. And so,
the one thing they could say would be the sanctions on Russia, which, that has been a choice. He doesn't have
but
to
they
have
don't
these
say
sanctions,
that.
but that's not being pointed to.
Right.
Well, could I add to that real quick? Because this is an important point about private control of these systems, right? So, Biden has, they just in the Permian Basin here, they've approved, I think, something near 900 new permits for drilling. You'd think that with prices so high that you would see this massive increase in oil production. But the vast majority of the oil companies in Texas, they're not ramping up production. In fact, they're taking their windfall profits and they're paying off their shareholders in dividends. Right. So at this moment, we can feel about oil and gas however, we do. But at this moment, there's a social need for there to be more affordable gas prices. And this private system is actually making the conscious decision to continue to maintain high prices. And instead of taking profits that they're getting and using that to reinvest in production, to hire, because something like 200,000 people were fired during the pandemic in the oil and gas industry. And, we're talking mainly people on the drills themselves. You would think that, maybe they'd use that money to reinvest in oil production, to sort of take care of folks, lower the price, and also make some money for themselves. No, they're just paying off their shareholders so that they can hold a very nice, stock position, and people are more interested in investing in those companies in the future, right? That's the number one problem here. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not somebody who's going to sit here and and shill for Joe Biden of all people. But yeah, no, the problem here is the private industry of oil production, not necessarily Joe Biden's policies, because he's running up on Trump now when it comes to opening up oil and gas permits in this country on public lands. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's very important, what you just shared about how that actually works, because that's, if anything, you could say Joe Biden is not addressing that problem, and therefore you could maybe throw some blame that way. But again, that's, not the perspective. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, that's the frustrating thing about, how politics gets interpreted by people in this country through the media is it's a Democrat bad or Republican bad, where it's typically if it is Joe Biden's fault, it's because of his fealty to capitalism. Right. Whether it's or it's because there's things we should have been doing a while ago. I mean, even this baby formula stuff too, right? It's that's it's going to get, it's played as is it the Democrats' fault or Republicans? It's this is a American monopoly capitalism problem.
Right. Yeah, the Fed increasing interest rates with the explicit goal to drive down wages from the Fed Chairman Powell. We just talked about that a second ago. Total political malpractice heading into the midterm. I mean, just from a totally cynical political point of view, if we don't even care about workers, going into this is not the time to be doing that. Driving down wages.
Nixon would never.
As an explicit policy goal.
Trump would never either. And that's the thing that has been so annoying about all of this, as you're starting to see, the bubbling of interest rates, and it's very clear that the Fed has an intention to wage war on working people. What do you get from Biden? Biden gets praised by liberal media and Politico, because Biden came out and he says the number one goal is to protect the independence of the Federal Reserve, which is just so bogus. I'm sorry, y'all. The Federal Reserve and the policies of what is effectively our central bank here affect millions of people, and people need to stop treating these things as if they're outside of politics. And it's just so cowardly to see Biden basically
Trump's
roll
Fed
over.
Chairman. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and then sorry to bring it back to the baby formula thing, but I'm just reminded of the Buttigieg quote. Let's be very clear. This is a capitalist country. The government does not make baby formula, nor should it. Companies make formula. And then still we still we have to talk about this in red versus blue.
Right.
Versus blue. Yeah.
Yeah. What about the fact that both red and blue support that? Right. I mean, that, you know, there's where you start getting into the deeper issues of, well, why is it that private industry alone is responsible for how we feed our babies? We have to rely on, you know, essentially a handful of companies to be able to feed our kids. And if they don't see if they don't see a profit interest in this quarter, maybe they don't do it. So
and
where
we're
does that
literally
leave us?
airlifting it in. We're airlifting it in now and acting like it's the free market that's going to solve the problem.
And just while we're sort of on this like kind of general question of oil and gas, and this is a good union show, I also just wanted to note something that's really important that's been happening here too with oil and gas workers. You know, Texas, like Alabama, is a state that does not have a tremendous amount of union density, though most states in the country don't anymore. But a lot of that is concentrated in, you know, those historical industries like oil and gas. And what you've seen from the oil and gas companies, particularly like ExxonMobil, has been a really, really brutal campaign to decertify unions here. In Beaumont, Texas, they did a lockout that went on for about like 10 months. And they weren't able to secure a really better deal for their workers. And there was a decertification campaign there that they barely won. I mean, they won by like the skin of their teeth. And there's a pivot that we're seeing in the oil and gas industry right now towards union labor here to basically try to eradicate, you know, the union workforce. And again, where is Biden sort of showing up for these people right now? And this, like, this is like, if you care about climate change, you know, you cannot just sit on your ass when the oil and gas industry is basically trying to eradicate unions in the state of Texas.
Yeah, that's something that we never really did a deep dive on that, but definitely something that we were following as it was happening, and
a lot of parallels to the Warrior Met coal strike here in Alabama.
And like you said, you know, just the idea that you would not, you know, another poll just came out putting the approval rate of unions at something like 70%. High, much higher than either political party. And the idea that you wouldn't, as a government, as a politician, try to ride the coattails of that and go out on the picket line as the president of the United States or try to mediate this. You know, I mean, Tim James, when he was running for governor, one of the things that he said on our program was Warrior Met doesn't want to tussle with the governor of Alabama, who has the ability to inspect their minds and make things very hard for them. You know, I mean, that's like a real threat. And Biden has just as much or more authority than the governor of Alabama would, than the governor of Texas would on that issue with MSHA. And so why would you not be like, you know, oh, you know, Beaumont, Texas, wow, you're really treating your, you know, this company's really treating your workers really poorly. Let's OSHA, why don't you take a look in there and see what's going on and just see if there's, you know, just do a spot check. Just do a spot check. I'm going to do that with one of my projects that I manage here with my safety person. We went on a site visit the other day, and she was like, well, I'm not really sure that I'm seeing what's representative, because they were allowed to kind of prep for it. They knew that the safety person was coming. So me and her are going to do like a secret surprise visit, like, hey, you know, safety people, let's see what's going on here. Why don't OSHA just stop by Beaumont, Texas? Why don't the, you know, Wage and Hour Division just stop by Beaumont, Texas? I mean, you know, the idea that you're not using these mechanisms to the fullest extent that you can is absurd.
Or do what the workers there were asking the Biden administration to do: no federal contracts to this company until they restore them to their jobs, right? Yeah, I mean, there really is such an absence of leadership, despite Biden sort of basking in this media portrayal of him as being like the most pro-union president of our lifetime.
Well, and there's no excuse for him either, because as we're going to get to later with his like dig at Elon, like he's conscious of unions,
right?
He's conscious of the political utility that unions can serve for him. And I mean, I don't know, like in our lifetimes, like he's probably more pro-union than Bill Clinton. He's probably more pro-union than the Bushes, Obama. Like it's a very low bar, sadly.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think that when people say he's the most pro-union president since FDR, it's probably true, which like sucks ass. But it's probably true. It's not great though.
That's
great.
like being the least racist president. Okay, like
Yeah.
all right. I mean,
Yeah, well, it's like-
how
it's
much of
just
a compliment is it?
It's like whereas like all the previous presidents would have had just like the straight like I don't know what the EKG machine. It's just a flat line.
Yeah,
Biden occasionally you see just the barest like sort of like hint at a pulse, like with that the National Guard case, or him taking shots at Elon, or there's improvements to the bureaucracy, but it's way lacking for what the moment actually calls for. I think everybody thinks that.
Right.
Well, so David, speaking of the union stuff in Texas, I just saw this tweet came across my dashboard from the Austin Starbucks Workers United. You cannot make us settle down. Austin is a union town. Come on, y'all, let's celebrate. Texas is a union state. Very cool. Starbucks Workers United, 24th and Nueces in Austin, Texas. But how, I don't know how closely you follow the Texas labor movement. I know that the Texas AFL-CIO endorsed Jessica Cisneros in both of her races against Henry Cuellar. What has been the state of labor in Texas as you see it?
I mean, it's a huge fight. I mean, what we're seeing, for example, with the Starbucks unions, I think is really encouraging. There's been a lot of push, for example, with folks here to really trying to expand unionization in the energy industry, particularly trying to focus on the growing solar and wind industry here, because that's one that really needs to be unionized, particularly like home installation, because the way that system works now is they basically get paid per panel. So you'll have people basically trying to bust their ass and, hold it, bringing up an entire panel on a ladder by themselves because they know they just have to like get as many done in a day. There's a lot of industry, a lot of injury. There's a lot of burnout there. And there's been some pretty exciting efforts from like the Texas Climate Jobs Project. Other people here, I have friends in the IBEW here who are really trying to expand as, you're seeing more opportunities, at least in Austin with like Tesla and a lot of these companies that are moving out here. There's a lot of jobs. And hopefully trying to grow that movement. But it's a tough moment because while we're seeing, some growth in, things like Starbucks unions and like just areas where, you didn't typically see too much unionization, the labor movement as a whole is, on its back feet and really trying to fight and push back against a really entrenched and I think purposeful at this point, movement to, try to end unionization in a lot of the areas, where it traditionally existed. But I mean, like where you see the National Guards Union is really exciting. Starbucks Union is really exciting. Some of the growth in the electrical industry is really exciting. But I think that particularly, I'll just speak to sort of, my general audience here on the left, that like, I think people need to get a little bit more comfortable showing up for some of these communities that a lot of kind of like lefties generally sort of ignore. And I'm talking about oil and gas workers and things like that, because that's the most viable. And also, if you're talking about climate change, the most important industry really to try to incorporate into the union movement right now. It's tough because too, politically, the unions are sort of in a rough position because, while they're, endorsing, for example, Cisneros statewide, it's like they don't get much politically for showing up for Democrats,
Right.
And it's a difficult situation for them trying to figure out how to make political interventions where it's like, okay, well, we can support like the pro-labor Democrat, but they're going to lose by 60 points in the election. And we don't really get much when it comes to, legislative sessions and things of that nature.
Right. Well, and then the last thing on Texas, how are people feeling? What has been the community response to the shooting in Uvalde, as far as on the gun issue, on the police issue, as just as a tragic human event? How have people been responding to that?
Well, I mean, it's tough. I mean, like, so in Austin, I think people probably feel the same way that they felt before, right? Where there's a lot of support for, more gun control measures. I think you're seeing a kind of invigoration of Beto to sort of push this. I mean, and everyone knows that famous line that Beto did in the 2020 when he ran for president, where he said he was going to come for your AR-15s. And, the common sense was like, okay, well, that's going to be playing 24/7 here in Texas going into the governor election. They probably will still use it, but I don't think it's going to hit the same way. I think what's most interesting to start to see if there's any kind of pivots or movement on this issue is what's happening in Uvalde, where particularly there's a lot of pushback against police. And, when people are seeing that these guys are sitting out there in their tactical gear, basically having coffee and hanging out with one another while somebody is murdering children, there's a lot of real serious questions about how much the police actually do for folks. And, in that community, reading some of the kind of on the ground reporting and interviews with people has been, I mean, first of all, obviously tragic, and very interesting to start to see people trying to, a lot of people have abandoned, kind of earlier held positions about, the sanctity of police. You can't ever criticize the police. But also some people are trying to find ways to sort of maintain that with just like the undeniable criticism that you have to, lob at these folks. I don't know how much it's going to be interesting to see if anything is able to sort of direct any of that energy somewhere, right? Because Abbott, the Democrats have basically asked for a special session, and like Texas is like different from a lot of other places. It's like the state that has the smallest, the shortest legislative window. It's every 2 years. It's very quick. But they can call a special session, and they're trying to get Abbott to call a special session. What he has called for is a special committee, which is where a bunch of boys get together in Austin and they talk to each other, and they release a press release. But even that special committee has been extremely limited to talking about doors and social media, stuff that, frankly has nothing, very little, if anything, to do with the crisis itself. So I think the people who are the most fervent about this were probably already, at least on gun control in general. I don't know what that's going to mean necessarily for the long term of the state, but I do think that the kind of untouchable question of, like, for example, like an AR-15 is a little bit less holy here. And just to be clear with folks too, like, the constitutional carry, which is what they did in response to El Paso, where, a bigot drove across the state to murder people there. The response to that from the government here was to make it legal to carry a handgun without a permit, which is just ridiculous. And that law is extremely unpopular, like across the board, Republicans and Democrats. Well, because nobody wants a guy to be sitting around without having any kind of basic training or permit or anything like that, carrying a gun in a Starbucks here. And I remind folks all the time too, that, like, despite the kind of image that's put forward by the right wing, the first laws that were put on the books here when Texas became a country and then a state were actually to limit firearms in public. Firearms and knives were the first things that were put into place here. So, like, the Texas tradition actually is to say, keep your guns. We respect that, but you're not bringing your weapons out into public. You're not bringing your weapons in the public square. And this new era that we're in here with permitless carry, constitutional carry, is really charting a new path. And I think, probably the most hopeful and likely result from this might be a successful push to start to claw back some of those rules, because there's not really a popular constituency for those. The popular constituency for those are Republicans who get a lot of money from the NRA, not necessarily everyday voters here. But until like the Democratic Party can sort of crawl itself out of the hole, there's not going to be much of a vehicle to shift these things. And that's sort of the number one issue with a lot of things here. Right.
Yeah. I feel you on that, the Democratic Party needing to crawl itself out of a hole. It's really, really bad in Alabama. So I am the Majority Report the other day with the fact that, where the Democratic gubernatorial candidates are in a runoff now, and both of them are anti-abortion. One of them was endorsed by the Democrats for Life, and the other was the only Democrat in the state to not vote against. She abstained when Alabama in 2017 or 2019 passed its abortion ban that does not include any exceptions for rape or incest, and is, I believe, at the moment of conception. And she didn't vote against it. It's crazy.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.